Okay, let's do this. All right. So if you've been following me for a while, then you may know that I live in the state of Tennessee. So I have lived in Tennessee for about 4 years. But I grew up in North Carolina. I very much consider myself to be a North Carolinian. Obviously, Tennessee borders. North Carolina is um, not that far away. So I do travel to North Carolina quite frequently. But I very much consider myself to be a North Carolinian. If you notice right now, I'm actually wearing a North Carolina hat. This is just a subdued version of the North Carolina state flag. You can see the N and the C, and you probably cannot notice it, but if you were to look really closely, you would see that there are banners above and below the N and the C. Inside each of those banners is a date. So if you're familiar with some of the things that I've written previously on my Substack, and we're going to go through some of that right now, or if you checked out the video that I made on April 12th, so just a couple of weeks ago, then you would have seen me draw attention to the North Carolina state flag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that again. I'm going to show an image of the North Carolina state flag, and we're going to look at the dates inside the banners on the flag. And then we're going to talk about why today's date is significant. Today, of course, is May 20th. So this is just the nc.gov page. So I'm just going to scroll all the way to the bottom because obviously I'm on a North Carolina state government page. Look here, you can see just a photo of the flag. It's not the best photo for what we're looking for, but it's good enough. All right. So you got the red and the white, you got this blue field here, and then you have a date and a gold banner up here, May 20th, 1775. And then you have another date down here. Now, because of the way the flag is blowing in the wind, it's slightly furled here, but this date is April 12th, 1776. So a couple of weeks ago, I wrote a Substack and then also put out a video calling attention to this date, April 12th, 1776, which is the date of a document known as the Halifax Resolves. We'll talk about that in a moment. But today, what I really want to focus on is this date, the first date that is mentioned on the flag, May 20th, 1775, or in other words, approximately 11 months before this date, April 12th, 1776. So May 20th, 1775, exactly 250 years ago, what happened on this date? Great question. Glad you asked. Let's talk about it. So I'm going to go to something that I wrote not that long ago, and I want to read just a little bit from it. So this is a piece that I wrote on April 12th, dealing with the Halifax Resolves that I just mentioned, but I'm going to read just a little bit of it because it will also help us to understand what the significance of May 20th is. So I'm going to start reading from this piece. It's called North Carolina First in Freedom. The subtitle is The Halifax Resolves. This is on my Substack. I'll put the link down in the description. And I put this out on my Substack on April 12th. So, a couple weeks ago. Today's date, April 12th, is an important date in North Carolina history, as well as in broader American history. The reason dates all the way back to 1776 and the push in the colonies for independence from Great Britain. The date is one of two found on the North Carolina state flag, as I mentioned in a previous Substack piece written on May 20th, 2023. May 20th is the other date included on the flag. So let me just stop right there. So two dates on the flag, May 20th, 1775, April 12th, 1776. So on April 12th, I wrote this Substack piece talking about the significance of April 12th, 1776 and the Halifax Resolves. But I opened the piece mentioning a previous Substack that I wrote back in 2023 on May 20th that talked about the significance of the other date, May 20th, today's date. All right, let me return to the piece and read. If your car is registered in North Carolina, you can choose from a variety of designs for your license plate. A popular design option that has been available for a long time is the first in flight version that refers to the aviation accomplishments of the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903. Another option includes both the national and state mottos, which are "In God We Trust" and "To be rather than to seem," respectively. However, my personal favorite is the "First in Freedom" option. This license plate design shows the same two dates that are also found on the state flag, along with the words "First in Freedom." All right, well, let's take a look at that so we know what we're talking about here. So let's look at just an image of this license tag. All right, so this is just the North Carolina Department of Transportation government website. But anyway, you can see here, not the greatest photo because the license plate is canted at an angle. But anyway, you can see it closely enough. So if you look, you're going to see here on this license tag design, you're going to see two dates. It's the exact two same dates that are on the flag: May 20th, 1775 and April 12th, 1776. And then you're going to see in bold red lettering the words "First in Freedom." Okay, so again, May 20th, 1775, April 12th, 1776, "First in Freedom." All right, so I'm going to return to the piece that I was just reading. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, returning to the reading. That's a bold claim. What basis is there for North Carolina to declare itself first in freedom? There are several key steps the Old North state took in the push towards independence. Several of these actions even preceded the July 4th, 1776 Declaration of Independence. Perhaps the most definitive of these actions was what came to be known as the Halifax Resolves, which were signed on April 12th, 1776, one of the dates on both the flag and the license plate. However, before we get to the Halifax Resolves, we should recall a few other steps taken before April of 1776 to understand where the resolves fit into the broader timeline towards independence. Now, if you're curious about the Halifax Resolves, go watch my other video that I put out on April 12th. All right, returning to the piece, Road to Independence. Clearly, tensions had been mounting in the colonies for some time, resulting in increasing disdain for British rule and the royal appointees. A few key events are listed below. A year before the Halifax Resolves, on April 19, 1775, a series of skirmishes occurred between British soldiers and colonial militia at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, also known as the Shot Heard Round the World. These events are considered to be the beginning of the War for Independence. Now, I did a whole video on that. Go find my video that I put out on April 19th, in which I commemorated the events of April 19, 1775, since it was the 250th anniversary. And I've got a video called, I think, Paul Revere's Midnight Ride or something along those lines. Go check that video out. It's actually, I go through everything that happens in the evening of April 18 into the morning of April 19th, and then what happens at Lexington and Concord. Anyway, on May 20th, 1775, one of the two dates on the state flag, a document known as the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence was supposedly written. Now, let me stop right there. Okay, so the first date on the North Carolina state flag and on the license plate, May 20th, 1775, exactly 250 years ago from today. Why is that date significant in North Carolina history and even in broader American history? Because a document was supposedly written called the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. If you know anything about North Carolina, you may know that the city of Charlotte is actually in the county named Mecklenburg County. All right, let me return to the reading. This document, if it ever existed, would be historically crucial because it would have been written more than a year prior to the July 4th, 1776 Declaration of Independence. Additionally, its text reads very similarly to the language used in some of the July 4th Declaration. Regardless of the authenticity of the document, which is largely rejected today, the cultural legacy of the document and the ideas it supposedly promoted have remained important to North Carolinians. Now, let me give a quick caveat there. It would be more important to North Carolinians culturally if North Carolinians even knew the significance of May 20th, but they don't, because many North Carolinians, like myself for a long time, had no idea what the two dates on our own state flag meant: May 20th and April 12th. May 20th, 1775, April 12th, 1776. And that's a shame. And even if you're not from North Carolina, I would say it's important for you to also understand what those dates are. All right, let me go back and keep reading. Though the legitimacy of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence has been widely discredited, another document was created just days later that has always been considered authentic. That document is the Mecklenburg Resolves, which were produced on May 31st, 1775. In fact, many historians claim that the belief in the Mecklenburg Declaration may stem from confusions and misrememberings over the very real Mecklenburg Resolves. Though the Resolves employed bold language that recognized a state of rebellion, the authors had recently become aware of the actions at Lexington and Concord the month prior and contributed to the ongoing spirit of independence. They were not themselves an unmitigated declaration of such. All right, stop right there. So there is this document called the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence that may or may not have existed. It supposedly had been produced on May 20th, 1775. That's the date on the flag. For a long time, many North Carolinians believed that that was a real document. Okay, nowadays, most historians say, no, probably not a real thing. Probably not an authentic document. Regardless of whether it is or isn't, 11 days later, on May 31st, 1775, so still more than a year before the July 4th Declaration of Independence, there was a document that was produced called the Mecklenburg Resolves. The Mecklenburg Resolves did say, hey, there is a state of rebellion going on in the colonies, right? And when that document was produced, the people who produced it were aware of what had happened the month prior at Lexington and Concord. Okay, news during that 5 or 6 week period between April 19th and May 31st had made it from Massachusetts down to North Carolina. So they were aware by the time May 31st rolled around, and this document, the Mecklenburg Resolves, was produced. And that document has always been regarded as authentic, regardless of whether or not the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence was or was not authentic. So two documents, both produced supposedly in May of 1775. One has never been disputed. It has always been regarded as authentic. The one that was produced first, supposedly, has been widely discredited. Now, that the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence was supposedly a Declaration of Independence. The Mecklenburg Resolves that came out 11 days later, that has always been regarded as authentic, did not quite go so far as to claim independence, though it did recognize that a state of rebellion existed in the colonies, and it did contribute to the ongoing spirit of independence. Okay, so that's where we're at in May of 1775, just to understand where we're at in the timeline between April 19th, 1775 and July 4th, 1776. All right, I'm gonna keep reading. About 9 months later, there was a key battle at Moores Creek Bridge on February 27th, 1776. This was an interesting and significant North Carolina battle, despite the fact that some say it perhaps lasted only a few minutes and few Americans know much about it today. It occurred between Whigs and Loyalists and was a key patriot victory that preceded the Declaration of Independence. I know about it because I remember creating a pretty cool papier-mâché mock-up of this battle in 8th grade for my required North Carolina history class. All right, I'm gonna stop right there. That's pretty cool. I talk about this in my video about the Halifax Resolves. Okay, so I'm gonna stop right there and I'm gonna switch over to the other Substack that I wrote that I put out on May 20th, 2023. And we're gonna talk about May 20th and the significance of the date a little bit more. But again, just to kind of drive home the point that I'm making. April 19th, 1775. You have Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, and then the following morning on the 19th, you have what happens at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. A few weeks later, a month later, on May 20th, 1775, you have the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which many historians now regard as inauthentic. But for a long time, North Carolinians considered to be authentic. And so the date began to gain cultural prominence in the mind of North Carolinians. Regardless of the authenticity of the May 20th Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, on May 31st, 1775, 11 days later, there was a document whose authenticity has never been disputed that was called the Mecklenburg Resolves. Now, this did not call for independence like the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence supposedly had, but it did continue to fan the flames of this ongoing spirit towards independence. Okay, then that's May 31st, 1775. Well, what happens 9 months later, in late February, February 27th, 1776, just a couple of months before July 4th, what happens? There is a battle between Whigs and Loyalists in North Carolina. That was what I was just referencing. Okay, there was a key Patriot victory in the early months of 1776. So all of this is going on in North Carolina. Okay, great. Let me read from the other piece. We're going to talk a little bit more about May 20th and its significance as a date in North Carolina history, but also across the board in American history. All right, so let me start reading. Today, May 20th, is a significant date in North Carolina history. In fact, it is one of two dates listed on the official state flag. Did you know that? Yes, you guys did, because we just talked about it. So you guys are well aware of that now. Few people within a state recognize the significance of those dates or know why they are even included on the flag. Sadly, North Carolinians don't know much about their own history. In this regard, they are not that different from other people from other states who also don't know much about their history. Unfortunately, few people anywhere seem to know much about their own history, but this failure to understand has an effect on identity. By the way, I didn't even mention this. The title of this piece that I wrote 2 years ago today on Substack is called History, Independence, and Identity. Historical Lessons from North Carolina's Flag. All right, let me return to the reading. It's too bad that North Carolinians understand very little about their state or its history because it's such an interesting place. I myself am a proud North Carolinian. I'm more than happy to continue to claim the state, despite the fact I haven't lived there in just over a quarter of a century. Since leaving North Carolina right after high school, I have lived in New York on 3 separate occasions, Georgia, Kansas, and now Tennessee, as well as a few places overseas. However, only North Carolina has ever been home to me, and I plan to move back to the state as soon as I can. We'll see if that happens. North Carolina is a cool state, not just because it happens to be where I'm from. For starters, it has a varied geography. It has a coastal state, or it is a coastal state, but in addition to its mainland coastline, it also boasts the Outer Banks. It also has it also is a mountain state. Every year, visitors flock to the Great Smoky Mountains or drive along the Blue Ridge Parkway. In fact, the highest peak east of the Mississippi River, Mount Mitchell, is found in North Carolina. And if you're curious, pretty sure that the elevation of Mount Mitchell at its peak is 6,684 feet. All right, anyway, continuing on. Historically, it's also a fascinating place. When I was in 8th grade, I took the state-mandated class on North Carolina history and still remember to this day some of the more interesting points. North Carolina's history starts in the early colonial period, long before the American independence from Britain. North Carolina had early English visitors that attempted to establish colonial sites decades before the first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Unlike Jamestown in Virginia, none of these earlier attempts in North Carolina resulted in successful settlements. The most curious case is that of the lost colony. North Carolina also bears the distinction of having the first child born to English parents, Virginia Dare. North Carolina is named for King Charles I. More specifically, The name is derived from Carolus, which is the Latin form of the king's name. Despite being named for a monarch, North Carolina would soon assert its desire for separation from Britain earlier than the other colonies. When it comes to independence, North Carolina has shown both a willingness towards audacity and caution at different times as the situations dictated. I take great pride in being from one of the original 13 colonies that participated in the War for Independence and formed the first Union. I appreciate being from a state that can trace its history to the founding of our current republic. For me, I feel that it grants me a particular kinship with those present at the time of the war with Britain and the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. Of course, that Philadelphia Convention 1787 is the one that produced our Constitution. And let me just take a moment and say, I'm not one of these people who believes that all the founding fathers were that they all had the exact same thoughts towards independence, or even those that did agree with independence from Britain, that they then had all the same thoughts when it came to exactly how to set up a new government or whatever. I mean, clearly there were a lot of differences. There were a lot of competing political philosophies. There were even some theological differences that the founding fathers had. So I'm not one of these people who thinks that our founding period was perfect, or that even that our founding documents are perfect. I do believe that they are good. I believe that what is good, and some of it very, very good, should be preserved. That doesn't mean that I don't think that in some cases they didn't necessarily go far enough in setting certain parameters. But anyway, all right, let's get back to the piece here. In terms of independence, North Carolina claims to be first. Now, let me stop right there. You out there listening to this or watching this, you know that because we just talked about the license tag, First in Freedom. I was reading from the other Substack, et cetera. So you're aware of that claim by North Carolina. All right, let me keep reading. That brings us to the first date on the state flag, May 20th, 1775. On this date, a certain document known as the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence was supposedly crafted, in which its creators referred to themselves as free and independent people. This would be significant in that this document predates the July 4th, 1776 Declaration of Independence by more than 13 months. However, the credibility of the Mecklenburg Declaration has long been disputed, though its cultural memory has remained relevant as a manifestation of the spirit of independence within the Old North State. Now, just so you know, the Old North State is an old nickname for North Carolina. While this document is now widely regarded as inauthentic, the validity of another document, the Mecklenburg Resolves, dated May 31st, 1775, has never been in question. The Mecklenburg Resolves were a set of inflammatory claims against Britain, though they did not call for independence. The Resolves further animated the people towards independence at a time of heightened tension and would therefore lead to more direct action a little later. Now, you know this because I was reading something very similar in the other piece that I wrote. This more direct step towards independence came in the form of the Halifax Resolves, signed on April 12th, 1776. All right, I'm going to skip a little bit of this portion because if you want to know about the Halifax Resolves, go find my video on that. Okay, despite North Carolina's lead in independence from Britain, it was more curious with its attitude towards the Constitution for the United States that came out of the Philadelphia Convention. North Carolina was the 12th state to ratify the Constitution, doing so only after George Washington had been elected the first president and the amendments that would comprise the Bill of Rights had been proposed. Only Rhode Island, who did not even send delegates to the 1787 convention, was later than North Carolina in ratification. All right, let's pause right there because that's really interesting. And just so you know, there is a distinction between the call for independence and wanting to secede from Britain and perhaps even fighting, a war over it, and then ratifying this new constitution. Okay, those were not necessarily seen as one being an obvious continuation of the other, just to kind of put it like that. There were people who were patriotic to the core. They did not necessarily see the need to either abandon the Articles of Confederation, which predated our current Constitution, obviously, or didn't necessarily like the draft of the Constitution that would end up being ratified and that we still have today. So it is interesting to look at North Carolina and see North Carolina as a state that was all about independence, but then cautious when it came to this new Constitution. And of the 13 states, was the 12th in ratifying. The only state later than North Carolina was Rhode Island, which used to be called Rogue Island at the time. Interestingly enough, that's true. The founding fathers had a sense of humor, and they, Rhode Island didn't even send delegates to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. All right, let's keep going. North Carolina's ability to exercise caution predominated in the days leading up to what became known as the Civil War, initially responding to Lincoln's 1860 election victory with a watch and wait approach. With respect to its sentiments in 1861, as secession fervor spread across the lower South, North Carolina adopted a more measured approach as it eventually put the issue to the people to decide. The popular vote was very even, a split of less than 1%, with the Unionist stance barely carrying the day. Okay, so what happens? All these tensions are flaring. North Carolina puts it to a popular vote. There's a very even split. But the initial vote is North Carolina decides we're not going to secede. After Lincoln's decision to invade the South, opinions across North Carolina changed dramatically. The state General Assembly reconvened and voted to secede on May 20th, 1861. So what happened? They changed their stance. Okay. So originally they were very cautious, had a watch and wait approach. Very evenly split, but the state decides not to secede. A couple of months later, after Lincoln's decision to invade the South, opinions change. The General Assembly votes, and the vote is passed to secede. Okay, that vote occurred on May 20th, 1861. Let me return and read. The May 20th date was deemed significant and chosen specifically because of its connection to the earlier Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which was still largely considered historically authentic and certainly culturally relevant by North Carolinians at the time. This deliberate selection of the May 20th date marked the perceived similarity between independence from the Union and independence from Britain 80 years earlier. After secession was decided upon, it was clear that the time for measured restraint had passed. North Carolina offered more troops to the Confederacy than any other Southern state. While competing origin stories abound with regard to the nickname Tar Heel, a preponderance of these seem to date to the Civil War. Whether meant positively or as a pejorative, the nickname was embraced by many North Carolina boys and appropriated as a reference to their ability to stick in battle. Tar Heels fought bravely at Gettysburg, but paid a high price for their courage. Though North Carolinian troops penetrated further into Union lines than any other Southern units on the third and final day of the July 1863 battle, they also made up the largest share of the casualties. North Carolinians accounted for 25% of the South's losses at Gettysburg, more than any other Confederate state. I am proud to be from a state with such historical gravitas, and I'm proud that she can trace her heritage back through the entire life of our republic and further. As I have mentioned, I am also intrigued by my state's capacity to be either bold or temperate in her actions as conditions dictate. I wish more people took an interest in their state's history and felt more ties of kinship with the state. I am proud to be an American, but that doesn't diminish my pride in my state, too. One of the most important principles of the founding period was federalism. The framers' concept of the Constitution in no way included a plan to design a monolithic body that could be ruled from the central capital. Yet today, too many people want to concentrate power in DC, even though events the past few years have demonstrated clearly that the model of federalism better preserves the rights and liberty of the people. When I look at my state's flag, I see two dates inscribed therein that reflect the desire that existed in the mid-1770s to exercise self-determination. I wish that this same desire persisted today, though evidence would suggest that people are less concerned with their own liberty these days. Freedom requires personal responsibility. If more people understood history and their connection to it, perhaps they would have a greater understanding of who they are. Okay. So today, May 20th. All right, we're in 2025. So exactly 250 years ago was May 20th, 1775. So regardless of whether or not the document that for a long time was believed to have been, published on that day, the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, regardless of whether that was or was not an authentic document, it did at least represent for a long time this cultural understanding of this spirit of independence that existed in the hearts and minds of many North Carolinians. And that spirit would persist, generations later, all the way up until the Civil War period, where on May 20th, 1861, North Carolina decided to secede. So regardless of your thoughts on the Civil War or whatever, that's not necessarily my point. My point is understanding the spirit that led to independence from Britain and then a desire for independence from a bloated imperial government in DC. And I do believe that there was a bloated imperial government in DC in 1861, much as there is today. So anyway, whether or not you agree with that, I did just want to share this today because I do believe that culturally it's very important. And I'm not super concerned about whether the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence was a validly authentic document, because even if it isn't, and my assumption is it isn't, its memory can still be culturally relevant, because people still held on to that idea for a very long time, and they perceived that date as being important. And so I think that date can still be considered to be important by us today. So thanks. I appreciate it. Regardless of whatever state you're from, you should know your state's history, just like you should know U.S. history. And if you disagree with certain portions of history, then at least know what they are. So then you know what it is that you disagree with. And you also know what it is that you agree with that you feel should be fought for and should be preserved. So thanks for being here as I share this with you today.